God's faithfulness to his promise. Now we get to the quote-unquote good part. I call this God's faithfulness to his promise, or the certainty of his promise, the latter of which is the King James Bible's heading. I'm going to start at verse 11. Hebrews 6:11 through 12 states, "And we desire that every one of you do show the same diligence to the full assurance of hope unto the end, that ye be not slothful, but followers of them who through faith and patience inherit the promises." He has been talking about the same thing from chapters 3 and 4, where he focuses on entering the rest of God. We know that the rest has two aspects, the Sabbath day and the good land. Both are pictures of partaking of Christ as our rest, which is pictured as the end of the journey. With the Sabbath day, you have the feast, the ordinances, the tabernacle, and the Holy of Holies. In order to enter the Holy of Holies, you make a journey through the outer court and the holy place. Beyond that, the Holy of Holies is a place where no work is done. Everything is finished and is thus the end of that journey. Once you get into the Holy of Holies, there is no further consideration of the outer court or the holy place. You are all the way in the veil with the presence of God. We will see more about this in coming chapters. Partaking of Christ is also represented by the good land, which is also portrayed as the end of a journey. It is interesting that both the journey into the good land and the journey into the holiest consists of three parts. With the journey to the good land, you have three phases: the exit from Egypt through the Red Sea, the wilderness, and then the entrance through the Jordan into the good land. With the journey to the holiest, you also have three phases: the outer court with the sacrifices, the holy place with the priestly maintenance of the tabernacle, and then the holiest of all. With the journey into the good land, each phase is separated by a river. The Red Sea separates Egypt from the wilderness, and the Jordan separates the wilderness and the good land. With the journey into the holiest, the outer court is separated from the holy place by a curtain. And there is another curtain, or veil, if you will, separating the holy place from the holiest of all. So we can see that by design, these two pictures correspond. The outer court in Egypt correspond. The holy place and the wilderness correspond. And the holiest and the good land correspond. The good land and the holiest are both called the rest, quote unquote, and typify Christ as our inheritance. Let's briefly look at these corresponding phases. Deliverance from Egypt in the outer court. With the tabernacle, the outer court houses the brazen altar where everything was judged. The lamb offered on the brazen altar corresponds with our need for a Passover, so we can be delivered from slavery in Egypt, ruled by Pharaoh, which is a type of the world ruled by Satan, where we are slaves. After making the sacrifice at the brazen altar, there was something called the laver, or the bronze sea, which was for washing with water. This washing corresponds with passing through the Red Sea, a picture of baptism, where we are washed and brought out of the world and into Christ. Regarding the wilderness and the holy place of the tabernacle, the wilderness represents the next stage of the journey to the good land and also corresponds with the holy place, which is the first room inside the tabernacle. The holy place is where the priest stood to minister continually. They had to attend to the bread, keep the lampstand burning, and offer the incense at the incense altar. We will see later that this represents religious dead works which cannot perfect the conscience and only serve to remind that the way into the holiest has not yet been made available. This corresponds to the entire period where Israel was wandering in the wilderness and could not enter the good land because of unbelief. Again, we will see more of this later. In the wilderness and in the holy place, there is no rest. You are following the things of God, but you are also trying to keep yourself, which is a mixture. The maintenance and service in the holy place corresponds with the life of trying to maintain yourself in the things of God. As we will see in Hebrews 9, as long as the holy place of the tabernacle still stands and that laboring is still going on, the way into the holiest of all has not yet been manifest. Likewise, as long as the children of Israel were in unbelief, they were consigned to wandering in the wilderness and could not enter the good land. Now, regarding the good land and the holiest of all. The good land corresponds with the holiest of all. Both are the end of the journey. The good land is the end of the journey into the inheritance for the children of Israel. And the holiest of all is the end of the journey through the tabernacle to rest in the presence of God. With the tabernacle, the holiest of all is the goal, and it is into this place that Christ brought us through his blood. There, in the holiest of all, we have Christ, who, quote unquote, ever lives to make intercession for us. Everything is finished. The blood has been presented and everything has been fulfilled. There was no conscience of sin in there. There was no continual striving. There was just the enjoyment of God's presence. That corresponds with the good land, where the good land had all the riches that were provided for them, the milk, the honey, everything just running out of the hills. It was so good. They did not have to strive. The idea was that there they could find their rest, their inheritance, and build the temple, living in God's presence. The holiest of all, the good land, and the Sabbath rest all represent different pictures of Christ in what he is to us, that we could partake of him. The good land represents this in the aspect of the kingdom. Entering into the good land was a matter of establishing God's rule. The holiest represents this in the aspect of the priesthood, where people serve in the presence of the living God. We are a kingdom of priests, and will be priests and kings in the next age. We will represent God's authority and his presence, and both are a matter of enjoying the riches of what Christ is, typified by the good land and the holiest. Meanwhile, the point of Hebrews is that we can enjoy this in a measure today. As he says, quote, we want to show the same diligence, the full assurance of hope, not be slothful, but followers of them who through faith and patience inherit the promise, end quote. What is the promise? The promise is that Christ would be our good land. Christ would be our rest, and Christ would be everything to us. He wants us to have full assurance of hope until the end, knowing that this is all secured by Christ. There is a bit of a process in our experience. On the one hand, the rest is ours by right, but on the other hand, we do have to labor to enter into that rest. We have to fully assure ourselves. We cannot stagger in our mind trying to keep the lamp lit by ourselves, trying to keep observing our spiritual life and trying to take care of it ourselves. This is life in the holy place or in the wilderness. If that's where we are not enjoying Christ. We have not entered the holiest of all or the good land in our experience. Or we may have entered but have fallen back into that realm. Thankfully, we have an anchor for our soul that has been cast into the holiest. We are tethered there and will be drawn back in by our high priest. He, Christ, is faithful when we are faithless because he cannot deny himself. The full assurance of hope is talking about us entering into a greater and greater realization of grace, to where we cease from our works and rest in Christ. Christ does everything. The way he brings us in is by his promise.